The first thing everyone saw when Mara Whitmore walked into the charity auction was not the silver tray in her hands, not the perfect rows of black truffle canapes she had spent 14 hours preparing, and not the tiny burn across her wrist where hot sugar had kissed her skin before dawn. They saw her body. They saw a beautiful plus-size woman in a fitted black server's dress, nearly 260 pounds, her dark curls pinned neatly at the back of her neck, her face soft and striking under the chandelier light. And before she could even set the tray down, someone near the champagne tower whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear that Dante Moretti's empire must be falling apart if he was hiding circus acts in the kitchen. The laughter that followed was quiet, polished, and cruel, the kind rich people used when they wanted humiliation to look like manners. But Mara did not drop the tray, did not lower her eyes, and did not let them see the way her fingers tightened around the silver handles until her knuckles ached. She had taken the job because her landlord had given her 11 days to save the bakery her mother left behind, and because the Moretti Foundation paid more for one private event than Mara usually earned in 3 months of selling pies, bread, and wedding cakes to people who remembered her mother, but rarely remembered to pay on time. She had been told to stay invisible, to use the rear entrance, to speak only to the household manager, and to let the guests believe the food had been designed by a celebrity chef whose name looked better on invitations than hers. That arrangement should have hurt less than it did, because invisibility had followed Mara most of her life, from school hallways to bridal shops to bank offices where men in pressed suits explained her own debt to her as if weight had made her stupid. But tonight was different, because everything she cooked was being used to impress the same donors who would decide whether her neighborhood clinic stayed open. And hidden beneath the kitchen's marble island, locked inside her mother's old recipe box, was a folded ledger page she had found by accident in a shipment of imported wine crates 2 hours earlier. At first, Mara had assumed it was a packing mistake. One more scrap of paper wedged between bottles with labels she could not afford to pronounce. Then she saw the names: judges, city inspectors, shipping officers, charity trustees, all written beside dollar amounts that were too clean to be random and too ugly to be donations. At the bottom of the page was the Moretti crest, a black lion stamped in wax, and beside it the initials of Dante Moretti's younger brother, Luca, the smiling man who had visited the kitchen that afternoon and told Mara with gentle contempt that the desserts should be smaller because women like her clearly did not understand restraint. Mara had folded the paper before anyone could see it, slid it into the recipe box that once belonged to her mother, and spent the next 2 hours moving through the kitchen with her heart pounding under her apron, knowing she had accidentally touched something powerful people might kill to bury. Dante Moretti arrived late, and the room changed before anyone announced his name. Conversations tightened, men stood straighter, women lowered their voices, and even Luca stopped smiling for half a second before stepping forward with open arms and a brotherly warmth that looked rehearsed from across the ballroom. Dante was 41, tall, controlled, and dressed in a black suit cut so sharply it seemed less worn than commanded. His face carried the kind of calm that made loud men look childish, and when he looked across a room, people had the strange instinct to confess things they had not been accused of yet. Mara had heard the rumors because everyone in New York had heard the rumors. The Moretti family owned restaurants, hotels, shipping companies, construction firms, and pieces of the city no public document admitted belonged to them. Some called Dante a criminal. Others called him a necessary evil. The people who owed him money called him Sir. Mara tried not to look at him, but she felt his attention before she understood why. One of the donors, a thin woman in emerald silk, had waved Mara over and taken a canapé from the tray with 2 fingers, inspecting it as if ugliness might be contagious. "Did you make these yourself?" the woman asked, her smile bright enough to cut. And before Mara could answer, Luca appeared beside them with a glass of champagne and said that the kitchen staff had followed instructions beautifully, considering the limitations they were working with. The woman laughed, letting her gaze travel over Mara's waist, arms, and face with slow enjoyment. "Limitations can be managed, I suppose," she said. And Luca, still smiling, added that the trick was keeping certain things behind doors where they belonged. Mara felt the old shame rise hot behind her ribs, but she held the tray steady because rent was due, because pride did not keep lights on, and because the ledger page in the recipe box had suddenly become more dangerous than any insult in the room. Dante heard enough. Mara knew he did, because his eyes moved from Luca to the woman in green, and then to the tray in Mara's hands, where one perfect pastry had cracked under the pressure of her thumb. He did not raise his voice, did not perform kindness, and did not look at Mara with pity, which somehow unsettled her more than cruelty would have. "My kitchen does not hide mistakes," he said, his tone low enough that only the circle around them heard it. "And if anyone in this room mistakes elegance for permission to be vulgar, they are welcome to leave before dessert." The woman's face tightened. Luca's smile returned too quickly. Mara kept breathing, because the entire exchange had lasted less than 10 seconds. But something inside the room had shifted, and something in Luca's expression told her that Dante had not merely defended a server. He had interrupted a game already in motion. The real attack came 20 minutes later, when the lights dimmed for the foundation speech and a large screen above the stage displayed photographs of sick children, rebuilt clinics, and smiling donors who loved being thanked in public. Mara was in the service corridor outside the ballroom when she heard Luca's voice through the speakers, warm and polished, speaking about integrity, family duty, and the responsibility powerful men carried toward those with less. She nearly kept walking until she heard her own name. Not Mara from the bakery, not the invisible caterer, but Mara Whitmore, spoken clearly into the microphone, as if she had been expected all along. She stepped closer to the curtain just as Luca announced that a trusted member of tonight's temporary kitchen staff had been caught attempting to remove confidential foundation documents from the estate, and while the guests murmured with delighted horror, 2 security guards entered the corridor and blocked the rear exit. For one breath, Mara did not understand the shape of the trap. Then she saw the household manager standing near the stage with Mara's mother's recipe box in both hands, its brass latch broken, its contents spread open for the room to see. The ledger page was gone. In its place, resting on top of old handwritten cake recipes and photographs of Mara's mother dusted in flour, was a velvet pouch filled with diamonds from the silent auction display. The accusation landed before the evidence was explained, and the guests turned toward the corridor as if cruelty had found them a better dessert than anything she had baked. Someone laughed that desperation made people bold. Someone else said thieves always looked harmless until they were searched. Mara's throat tightened, but she did not beg, because begging would only make them hungrier. Dante moved before Luca finished speaking. He crossed the ballroom with a silence more frightening than anger, and every guard in the corridor seemed to measure whether they belonged to Luca or to him. Mara looked at him and saw no rescue in his face yet, only calculation, suspicion, and a hard intelligence trying to decide whether she was victim, criminal, or something inconvenient between the two. Luca stepped down from the stage with theatrical regret and said that no one wanted to embarrass her, but the foundation could not ignore theft, especially when sensitive family records were involved. Mara understood then that he knew about the ledger, knew she had found it, and had chosen her body, her poverty, and her invisibility as the perfect container for his crime. Dante stopped in front of her, close enough for Mara to see the faint scar near his jaw, and asked in a voice that carried through the corridor, "Tell me what was in the box before my brother touched it." Mara could have said nothing, because silence had protected her for years, or she could have told the truth and signed whatever danger came next. She looked past Dante at the broken recipe box, at her mother's handwriting exposed under ballroom lights, at Luca's patient smile, and at 200 wealthy strangers waiting for the large woman in the server's dress to collapse into the role they had already chosen for her. Instead, she lifted her chin and answered with the only thing she still owned. "A page with your family crest, your brother's initials, and enough names to burn this room down," she said, and before Dante could respond, every light in the ballroom went black. The darkness did not create panic at first. It created calculation, because the people inside that ballroom were too wealthy, too guilty, or too well trained to scream before they understood who might benefit from fear. Mara heard the first gasp near the stage, then the scrape of chair legs, then Luca's voice cutting through the black with a command for everyone to remain calm. But what frightened her was not the darkness itself. It was the sudden pressure of Dante's hand closing around her wrist, firm enough to stop her from moving, but careful enough not to hurt the burn beneath her sleeve. "Do not run," he said near her ear, and the warning sounded less like suspicion than survival. A second later, glass shattered somewhere behind the champagne tower. A woman cried out that her necklace was gone, and one of the guards in the corridor reached for Mara, with the confidence of a man who had already been paid to find her guilty. Dante moved her behind him before the guard's hand touched her shoulder, and the speed of it told Mara something his face had not. He did not fully trust her, but he trusted the trap less. Emergency lights bled red along the baseboards, turning the corridor into a narrow wound between the kitchen and the ballroom, and in that dim glow, Mara saw Luca standing near the stage with his phone in one hand and his other hand resting lightly on the household manager's back, as if comforting the very woman who had delivered the broken recipe box into public view. The manager would not look toward Mara. That small refusal said more than any confession could have said. Dante noticed it too, because his jaw tightened once, almost invisibly, before he told the closest guard to seal the exits and bring him the security feed from the kitchen corridor. Not tomorrow, not after the police arrived, but now. Luca crossed the room with a calm that had been polished for witnesses, and by the time he reached them, several donors had gathered behind him with the hungry silence of people who enjoyed scandal more when it happened to someone poorer. "Brother," Luca said, lowering his voice as if mercy required privacy, "you are turning a simple theft into a spectacle because a woman you met tonight knows how to sound desperate." Mara felt the insult land exactly where Luca wanted it, not only on her body or her poverty, but on the shame of being believed too easily capable of stealing diamonds because the world had already decided women like her wanted what prettier, thinner, richer women possessed. Dante did not answer immediately. He looked at Mara instead, and for one terrible second she saw the question in his eyes, not whether she had stolen the diamonds, but whether the ledger page truly existed. "Open every camera," he said at last, "including the ones my brother disabled." That was the first moment Luca's expression cracked. It lasted less than a heartbeat, but Mara saw it, and so did Dante. The emergency generator groaned somewhere beneath the estate. The main lights began returning in sections, and with each chandelier that came alive, the guests looked more exposed than relieved. A young technician arrived with a tablet and trembling hands, followed by a security captain whose face had turned the color of old paper. He whispered that the kitchen corridor footage had gone missing for 12 minutes, beginning 6 minutes before Mara's box appeared in the ballroom, and ending 1 minute after the diamonds were supposedly discovered. Luca exhaled with theatrical disappointment, already prepared. "Convenient," he said, glancing at Mara. She was alone in the service area during that exact window, and now the footage is gone. Mara almost laughed, because the lie was so perfect that innocence felt useless. But then she remembered the small brass clock above the pastry station, the one her mother had taught her to wind by hand, because old things told the truth when modern things were paid to forget. She turned to Dante, forcing herself not to lower her voice, even as every instinct told her to disappear. "There is another camera," she said. "Not one of yours. A delivery driver broke a mirror by the pastry station this afternoon, and the replacement has a tiny lens in the frame because your insurance company wanted proof after last month's wine theft." The security captain looked startled. Luca's face emptied. Dante stared at her long enough that Mara could feel him rearranging his opinion of her piece by piece, taking her out of the simple category of frightened staff and placing her somewhere more dangerous, closer to witness, closer to survivor. "Get it," Dante said, and when Luca stepped forward as if to object, Dante turned only his eyes toward him. "Careful," he added. "The next sentence you speak may become evidence." The mirror footage arrived 11 minutes later, and those 11 minutes stretched through the ballroom like a wire pulled too tight to touch. Mara stood near the kitchen entrance under the gaze of strangers who had already laughed at her once, and now watched with the tense irritation of people who disliked being forced to reconsider their cruelty. One older man muttered that even if she had not stolen the diamonds, kitchen staff should not handle family documents. A woman near him said people brought trouble when they did not know their place. Mara kept her hands folded in front of her, feeling the burn on her wrist pulse with each heartbeat, and made herself look at the broken recipe box instead of the faces. Her mother's handwriting lay scattered across a table meant for champagne glasses and donation cards. Recipes for lemon pound cake, sweet rolls, and peach preserves exposed beside diamonds planted to ruin her, and the humiliation became so sharp that it steadied her. When the video finally appeared on the ballroom screen, it began in silence, filmed from the mirror's high corner with a narrow view of the pastry station, the marble island, and the service door. Mara watched herself place the recipe box under the counter, check the ovens, and leave with a tray. 5 minutes later, the household manager entered, followed by the same guard who had reached for Mara in the dark. The guard forced the latch with a knife. The manager removed a folded page, slipped it into the inside pocket of her jacket, and replaced it with the velvet pouch. A low sound moved through the guests. Not quite outrage, not quite embarrassment, because people who had enjoyed the accusation now had to decide whether justice required admitting they had been entertained by a lie. Dante did not look away from the screen. Luca did. That was his second mistake. Dante asked the manager where the page was, and for a moment she tried to keep the posture of a loyal employee who had made one tragic error. But loyalty dissolved when Dante told the security captain to search her jacket in front of everyone. She began crying before they touched her. She said Luca had promised her medical bills would be paid, that he had said no one would believe Mara anyway, that the page was not supposed to stay missing forever, only long enough to make Dante cancel the audit scheduled for midnight. The word audit changed the air more than the theft had. Donors looked toward one another. Trustees stopped pretending not to understand. Mara looked at Dante and saw, for the first time, pain beneath the discipline, because betrayal from strangers could be punished, but betrayal from blood had to be survived before it could be answered. Luca clapped once, slowly, and the sound was so strange that even the manager stopped crying. "This is becoming impressive," he said, and the softness in his tone was more threatening than shouting would have been. He turned toward the guests, spreading his hands as if inviting them to witness reason. A frightened employee blames me. A convenient hidden camera appears, and my brother, who has been looking for an excuse to remove me from the foundation for months, suddenly finds one through a woman with debt, motive, and access. Then he looked at Mara, and the kindness he put into his face made her skin crawl. "Tell them about the eviction notice, Mara. Tell them how much money would save your bakery. Tell them whether a woman about to lose everything might copy a page, steal diamonds, and sell both to the highest bidder." The room turned again, not fully against her, but enough to remind Mara that truth did not win once. It had to keep winning every time power changed the question. Dante saw the shift and stepped closer. But Mara knew if he defended her too quickly, Luca would make her look like his weakness. She swallowed the fear, reached into the pocket of her apron, and removed the one thing she had not told anyone about. A sugar-stained delivery receipt from the wine crate, marked with the same shipping code as the ledger page, and signed by Luca's private driver. "I kept this because the crate arrived under a false kitchen order," she said, her voice steady enough to surprise even herself. "And because your brother was not the only name on that page." Luca's smile vanished, but before Mara could say the next name, the front doors of the ballroom opened, and Dante's fiancée walked in wearing a white gown, holding the missing ledger page in her hand. Dante's fiancée did not walk like a bride arriving late to her own celebration. She walked like a witness who had spent too long deciding whether survival was worth silence. Celeste Verone crossed the polished floor with her veil torn at one comb, rain shining on the shoulders of her white gown, and the missing ledger page held between two fingers as carefully as if it were both poison and proof. Luca recovered first, because men like him survived by speaking before truth could settle. He moved toward her with a wounded tenderness that might have fooled anyone who had not seen his mask slip twice already, telling her she was confused, frightened, and being manipulated by Dante's paranoia. Celeste stopped 3 steps away from him and raised the page high enough for the nearest trustee to see the black lion crest, Luca's initials, and a second column of names Mara had not reached before the lights died. The second column did not belong to shipping officers or city inspectors. It belonged to patients. Children from clinics the foundation claimed to save, families who had signed emergency aid forms and unknowingly become covers for stolen donations, fake medical shipments, and cash transfers buried beneath charity invoices. Celeste's voice shook only once as she explained that Luca had asked her to hide the page in her bridal suite after the lights went out, promising it was evidence Dante would twist against the family, but she had read enough before locking the door to understand that the foundation was not merely being used for bribery. It was being drained through sick children, grieving parents, and neighborhood clinics that people like Mara depended on when there was nowhere else to go. The donors who had laughed at Mara's body now stood under the same chandeliers with their names reflected in champagne glasses, learning that cruelty had only been the smallest ugliness in the room. Luca's face changed in a way Mara would remember for years, not because it became frightening, but because it became honest. The charm drained out of him, leaving behind a cold exhaustion, as if he resented everyone for forcing him to admit what power had always meant to him. He told Celeste she had no idea what families like theirs sacrificed to keep empires alive, then turned on Dante with a bitterness too old to have begun that night. According to Luca, Dante had inherited respect, fear, and the final voice in every room, while he had been left to clean the soft parts of the business, to charm donors, flatter politicians, and make corruption look charitable enough for public applause. "You wanted the Moretti name clean," Luca said, his voice carrying through the room with the ugliness of a private war made public. "I gave you clean money on paper, and all it cost was people nobody here ever saw." Dante did not strike him, though several men in the room seemed to expect violence and almost hope for it, because violence would have made the story easier to understand. Instead, Dante took the ledger page from Celeste, placed it beside Mara's delivery receipt, and told the security captain to call the federal liaison whose number was sealed in the foundation's audit file. Luca laughed then, but the sound broke when Dante added that the midnight audit had never been canceled, because he had scheduled it after noticing 3 clinics receiving shipments they never requested, and 1 bakery in Queens being listed as a food vendor for events Mara had never catered. Mara turned toward him slowly, the truth arriving with painful clarity. Dante had already suspected the foundation was being used, but he had not known where the proof would surface, and tonight Luca had tried to destroy the one woman whose name had been forged into the fraud, because he believed no one would pause long enough to listen to her. Mara should have felt relief, but the feeling that came first was rage, deep and steady, rising from places older than the accusation. She walked to the table where her mother's recipes lay scattered beneath the diamonds, and because every person in that ballroom was watching now, she gathered each stained card with careful hands, instead of letting someone else clean up the wreckage of her dignity. When she spoke, she did not speak to Luca first. She spoke to the trustees, donors, and elegant strangers who had accepted her humiliation as entertainment until it threatened their reputations. "You believed the diamonds before you believed my voice," she said, holding the recipe cards against her chest. "And that is why men like him use women like me, poor women, fat women, invisible women, because the world saves its doubt for people with money and spends its suspicion on everyone else." No one interrupted her, not because the room had become kind, but because truth had finally become more dangerous to ignore than to hear. Luca made his last mistake when he reached for Celeste. He did it quickly, not enough to look violent to those who wanted excuses, but enough for Mara to step between them before any guard moved. His hand struck Mara's shoulder, and the contact was all Dante needed. The security captain seized Luca from behind. Celeste stumbled back, and Dante crossed the space with a controlled fury, so contained it made the air seem colder around him. He did not shout. He told Luca that touching her ended whatever protection blood had left between them. And when Luca tried to invoke their father, the family, the empire, Dante answered that a name built by feeding on the helpless deserved to burn before it deserved to be defended. The federal agents arrived 17 minutes later through the east entrance, not as saviors from nowhere, but as the final consequence of evidence Dante had already set in motion, and evidence Mara had been brave enough to keep alive. By midnight, Luca was gone. The household manager had signed a statement. The corrupt guard had turned over his phone, and half the board had been detained in a private dining room, while investigators copied every foundation file. Celeste removed her engagement ring in the kitchen, not with drama, but with the tired grace of a woman who had mistaken comfort for safety, and finally chosen truth over a beautiful cage. She apologized to Mara without asking forgiveness to make herself feel clean, and Mara accepted the apology without pretending the wound had vanished. Dante stood near the pastry station, his jacket gone, his sleeves rolled with the same practical severity he brought to everything, watching Mara repair the brass latch on her mother's recipe box with a strip of kitchen twine. "I should have believed you faster," he said, and Mara kept her eyes on the knot because looking at him made the night feel too large. "Yes," she answered, "you should have." The next morning, Mara returned to her bakery expecting eviction papers and found 3 Moretti attorneys waiting beside her landlord, not to buy her silence, but to present corrected records showing her lease had been targeted through one of Luca's shell companies after she refused to sign a false catering invoice months earlier. Dante did not offer to rescue her by owning what she loved. He offered restitution, legal protection, and a foundation contract under her name, with every clinic meal program supplied by Whitmore Bakery at full price and public credit. Mara read every page before signing anything, made 2 attorneys rewrite 3 clauses, and watched Dante's mouth curve slightly when she told him that gratitude did not make her careless. Months later, when the bakery windows glowed before sunrise, and neighborhood nurses came in for coffee between shifts, people began speaking her name with the same respect they once reserved for rooms she was not allowed to enter. Dante came every Thursday at 5 in the morning, never with flowers at first, never with speeches, only with coffee, quiet updates on the clinics, and the patience of a man learning that protection meant nothing if it crowded the person it claimed to honor. Mara made him earn ordinary things before she trusted extraordinary ones. She let him wash mixing bowls, carry flour, taste burned batches, and sit in silence while she spoke about her mother, her debt, her anger, and the strange grief of being seen only after nearly being destroyed. By winter, the Moretti Foundation had been rebuilt under public oversight. Celeste ran the women's legal fund that helped expose the remaining board members, and Luca's trial filled headlines with words the rich usually paid to bury. On the first snowy morning of December, Dante arrived with no guards visible, placed her repaired recipe box on the counter after having its latch restored in brass, and told Mara that the strongest person in his world had never been the one people feared most, but the woman they had mistaken for someone easy to break. Mara looked at the box, then at the man who had learned to stand beside her without standing in front of her, and when she finally took his hand across the flour-dusted counter, it was not because he had saved her from shame, but because he had stayed long enough to understand she had never needed permission to be worthy of love.